Good afternoon. My name is Rob Schwarzwalder. I have the privilege of serving as Senior Vice President here at the Family Research Council. On behalf of our President, Tony Perkins, and all my colleagues, thank you so much for joining us. Those of you viewing online, we're so glad that you could be with us even virtually out in the internet world. Well, today we're privileged to have one of America's leading thinkers about not only economic but also theological issues. I should note Seattle, Washington is the home of some of the nation's most far-out liberalism. Yet it's also been where some of America's greatest corporations have also taken root. Boeing, Microsoft, Weyerhaeuser, Amazon, Nordstrom, just to name a few. It's also home to some of America's greatest people, in my humble but accurate opinion. I include my extended family in that number, and I also include today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Jay Richards. Religious and economic liberty support one another, providing a reason for libertarians and fiscal conservatives to join the cause of defending and promoting religious liberty as a matter of practice, not just intellectual belief. At a time when religious liberty, the right not just to affirm a set of intellectual beliefs, but to practice their implications in one's daily life, is under threat, today's lecture is especially important, and no one is better qualified to speak to this set of issues than Dr. Richards. Jay Richards has a PhD, and he's also a member of the Dominican Order of Preachers. He is an assistant research professor in the School of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America, executive editor of The Stream, a new and increasingly important resource for conservative news and comment, and a senior fellow at the Seattle Discovery Institute. Dr. Richards is author of many books, including the New York Times bestsellers Infiltrated, 2013, Indivisible, and Money, Greed, and God, which provided him with the Templeton Enterprise Award, and he spoke about that issue in 2010 here at FRC. Dr. Richards also co-authored the video The Privileged Planet with astronomer Guillermo Gonzalez. I'd encourage all of you to watch that. Not only are we fearfully and wonderfully made, so is our planet, and Jay has documented that brilliantly. His most recent book, co-authored with Jonathan Witt, is The Hobbit Party, the vision of freedom that J.R.R. Tolkien got and the West forgot. 2 weeks ago, we heard a mutual friend, Dr. Joe LeConte, here speak about a hobbit and a wardrobe and a war. So this apparently is a very Middle-earth-focused group here at FRC. Jay's articles and essays have been distributed in many publications on topics ranging from culture, economics, and public policy to natural science, technology, and the environment. If we've ever had a polymathic speaker, it is Jay Richards. Jay has also appeared as, he has spoken to members of Congress, congressional staff. He graduated from Princeton University with a PhD in philosophy and theology. He holds graduate degrees in theology and an undergraduate degree in political science and religion. If this man were any more encyclopedic, I would be here all day. And barring that fact, however, it's a real joy for me to introduce a great friend of FRC's and a great friend of mine, Dr. Jay Richards.
Well, it's great to be with you all, and I love being at FRC. I realize I need to take the Hobbit Party out of my bio because I know, because I do this, oh good, we're going to hear about Tolkien and hobbits, and I'm not actually going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about a sort of philosophical and policy thing, though Tolkien would have things to say about this particular issue. But what I want to do today, briefly, and I want to leave a lot of time for discussion and questions, is I want to develop an argument that frankly is still a work in progress. A lot of us have very clear intuitions that religious freedom and economic freedom are somehow inextricably tied, that they're important philosophically, they fit together, that they fit together socially, and that it's ultimately a mistake, as we see sort of happening, unfortunately, in the American political scene, to treat these as if they're sort of different issues that are in different baskets. And so this sort of popular convention, certainly over the last decade, at least on the right, has been to say, well, there are moral and social and maybe religious issues, and those go in one basket. So we'll put religious freedom, and we'll put marriage, we'll put the family, those kinds of things. Those are in the social basket. And then we've got a fiscal basket that has to do with taxes and economic freedom and trade and things like that. I think that's sort of bad politically, but I also think it's bad philosophically because it treats issues that are actually grounded both historically and philosophically in the same set of ideas as if they can somehow be separated. And so really what I want to do is I want to, on the one hand, show that it's a serious mistake for people that are social conservatives. In particular, if you're deeply religious and the ideas that animate you are primarily your theological and religious beliefs, to convince you that you have a stake in the arguments for economic freedom. On the other hand, if you're the sort of person that really, maybe you're religious, maybe you're not, but what really animates you is economic freedom and entrepreneurship and free trade and innovation, and you really find all the arguments about marriage and religious liberty somehow unsavory, or you don't want to really deal with them, I want you to realize that you actually have a stake in those questions as well. That these two issues, religious and economic liberty, ultimately will stand or fall together. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the sort of legal details. There's a lot of people that speak at FRC. In fact, there's a lot of scholars that handle the legal details far more than I do. I'm not a legal scholar, but of course this is a current issue, as we've learned just in the last week or so, that the Supreme Court is going to take up a set of cases involving this question that actually connects an economic issue having to do with the Affordable Care Act with a religious issue. And of course, I think that the most sort of telegenic and memorable example of this is, of course, the Little Sisters of the Poor. My sense is if I were President Obama is that I wouldn't have wanted to get in a situation in which the Supreme Court were considering essentially the federal government against the Little Sisters of the Poor. That's a sign that, okay, something's gone wrong here. And so I'm actually surprised that an accommodation hasn't already been reached. But for those of you that don't follow the details, the Little Sisters of the Poor are a Catholic religious order that essentially does hospice work. So though they themselves are Catholic sisters and it's a Catholic ministry, they don't restrict the people that they help to Catholics. In fact, they don't discriminate. They essentially say, look, if you're an elderly poor person, you're in need of care, and we're there and we can help you, then they will. So as a result of essentially a decision to be broad-minded rather than parochial, they have failed to qualify for an exemption under the Affordable Care Act with respect to the health care that they provide. So essentially, they, from their perspective, what I think is the correct perspective, are compelled under the Affordable Care Act and the Health and Human Services mandate to provide certain drugs and provisions that violate their deeply held religious beliefs. In particular, not just mere contraception, but abortifacient types of contraception, which directly violate not just long-standing Christian ideas about the impermissibility of abortion, but strike at the heart of specifically Catholic understanding of life and marriage and the sexual act. So this is a really, really clear case. Frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if it was not 9-0 in favor of Little Sisters of the Poor when this all washes out, but that animates the discussion. Now, what's important here to realize is the irony is that many Catholic and Christian organizations advocated and lobbied for the bill that was eventually passed into law, the Affordable Care Act. If not the bill itself, then the basic idea that the federal government ought to be in the business of sort of overhauling and centralizing, if you will, 16% of the American economy having to do with health care. Right? And they advocated this for what I think were noble reasons. There are people that don't have health insurance through no fault of their own. They either lose their jobs or they're simply too poor to afford it. We need to do something to help those people. That's the moral motivation. But what they didn't do is they did not think through both the economic and the religious implications of the bill. And so I can imagine Catholic organizations that advocated this bill, they didn't imagine, for instance, that something having to do with health care would end up directly compelling them to violate their deeply held religious beliefs. And if they did, what they imagined is that there would be special carve-outs or exceptions put into the bill to prevent them from doing that. And I think that's a fundamental mistake to do that. It's a mistake because it fails to see the way in which economic freedom and religious freedom are intricately connected. And you just simply, except in a very ad hoc and arbitrary way, can't ultimately separate these things. So I want to try to sketch how I think that argument goes. I'm not going to prove it to you because, as I said, it's sort of an argument in development. But here's what I think is going on. So first, let's talk about the basis of religious freedom. I don't mean the legal basis for religious freedom, but this very idea, right, that we take for granted, and it's not really taken for granted even fully in the West. You know, in the highly secular Western country of Germany, there are still church taxes. That seems strange to us as Americans, but Americans, whether religious or secular, generally take for granted the idea that people ought not be coerced in certain religious questions, that people ought not to be forced by the state, for instance, to either to profess the Nicene Creed or to deny it, that choices about religion ought to be left up to communities and individual conscience. That's a fairly newfangled idea. It wasn't always common in the West, and it's certainly not common worldwide. In fact, I suspect that the majority of the human race at the moment still doesn't quite get that. So what's the basis for this idea? Well, clearly, I think the sort of best articulations of the idea of religious freedom come both from the Declaration of Independence, an American document, and then the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights to the Constitution in an American context. But I think you can also ground it biblically, insofar as the biblical and Judeo-Christian tradition is a part of what created the West, and I think it's easy to sort of make that case. It's important to point out that there's actually sort of a biblical case to be made for religious freedom. And then I think actually the kind of best theological, philosophical defense of this idea actually emerged in a Vatican II document, an encyclical called Dignitatis Humanae. Now, those of you who know Catholic history know that the church was sort of a long time in developing a clear understanding and sort of articulation of what religious freedom meant. And I actually think, whether you're Catholic or not, because Dignitatis Humanae was actually designed to say, okay, both in the Christian tradition, in religion, and in the natural law, there's a case to be made for religious freedom. In other words, if you simply understand the truth about man, the truth about what human beings are, then you ought to understand that human beings ought to enjoy and exercise religious freedom. So we sort of have three sources of this. Now, what's a biblical case? The sort of clearest case, if you're a Christian, is simply to look at the New Testament, to look at the person of Jesus himself. Jesus himself nowhere suggests that people ought to be compelled into the kingdom of God. He nowhere suggests that people ought to be compelled to worship him. He is everywhere and always calling for people's free assent, right? For their free forgiveness and love, because love itself, right, a sort of precondition for genuine love is freedom. If you force someone to love you, by definition, right, they're not loving you because you had to force them to do that. It's the same thing with virtue. If someone is compelled to do something, then they're not exercising virtue because it doesn't sort of emerge from their freedom. So simply the person of Jesus, I think, by itself suggests something like this, but also the pregnant story in the Gospels of Jesus being asked the trick question about whether taxes ought to be paid to Caesar. What does he say? He asks for a coin, which is, of course, a Roman coin. He says, whose inscription is on the coin? It's Caesar's. He says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render unto God the things that are God's. Now, it's actually a really profound claim, because remember, it was at this time that the sort of Republic of Rome had disappeared, and we'd entered into imperial Rome, in which there were claims to divinity for Caesar. This is a thing that in a 21st century context we don't really get. But it's first a kind of rebuke to the claims of divinity and sort of absolute authority on the part of Caesar. So it's partly that, right? It's also that there are things that are God's that are outside the jurisdiction of the state. They're outside the jurisdiction of Caesar. And then the thing that, of course, would have been noticed to his Jewish hearers in the first century is the idea that, well, the Caesar, though he's limited, though there are things outside his jurisdiction, he does have some legitimate authority, right? There's sort of a political realm that has a general legitimate authority, but it's not everything and it's not absolute, right? So I think that's this biblical idea, the sort of biblical ground of this idea. And then when you get to the American experiment, of course, Thomas Jefferson's famous words, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because Jefferson does, and what the founders did generally is they tied together essentially two sources of authority. On the one hand, notice it's explicitly theological. And in fact, I think it's really hard to ground a persuasive case for individual rights and individual freedom completely shorn of a theological context. In fact, if you look at what happened after World War II with the UN Declaration on Human Rights, of course, the goal was to develop a sort of articulation of individual rights that was sort of appropriately secular. This is 1948, it's the UN. Couldn't do it. It's actually really hard to come up with something without an appeal to a theological category that transcends us. On the other hand, if human beings are created in the image of a transcendent and personal God, and for that reason have intrinsic value and dignity, it's really easy to make the case. Well, ironically, Jefferson, in writing the Declaration, what he did is he made an explicitly theological case. We're endowed by our Creator. But he also said it was self-evident. Right? Now, that's actually kind of a strange thing to say, but what was going on was this clear idea of a kind of a doctrine of natural rights and natural law, that there's this, that at least human reason, properly informed and properly oriented, can get to the conclusion that human beings have a sort of special and unique dignity apart from other sort of animals or plants or whatever. Right? So Jefferson actually said now, and if you really get it, if you really understand what the human person is, then you understand that we're endowed by our Creator with these rights, that certain rights inhere to us. So it's both an object of religious tradition and religious revelation, and it's also a sort of conclusion from reason properly construed. Now then, the question, of course, is, well, why doesn't everybody notice this, right? If it's self-evident, why do they have to put it in a document? Well, of course, I think that Christian theology provides a way of accounting for that. There are things that your reason can do when it's properly oriented. It's just that most of the time our reason doesn't really work very well, right? And so it tends to be governed by the passions. It tends not to reach the conclusion. So people get a glimpse of what the human person is, but they don't ever sort of work out the implications. I'll give you one example. Ayn Rand, right? The 20th century's most widely read defender of economic freedom. She was viciously anti-Christian, and she was a hardcore atheist. So Rand, right? So I'm using her precisely because she's so extreme. This is Rand. I'm quoting her directly. Man, every man is an end in himself and not the mere means to the ends of others. Now, if you're a materialist, where do you get that idea? Right? If you're an atheistic Darwinist that thinks that, human beings, in fact, human nature doesn't even actually exist, we're the result of purely blind processes that are not different in kind from other apes and other animals. Maybe we've got bigger brains and things like that, but there's nothing fundamentally different about us. That would be where sort of materialism and atheism would get you. And yet Ayn Rand, the hardcore atheist and anti-Christian, got the idea that human beings ought not to be treated merely as the means of others. What's happening there? What's happening there is that she sort of, I think, unconsciously was informed by this Judeo-Christian idea, but also I think her reason was still partially working. She just knew, it was just obvious to her that there's something different and special and exceptional about human beings. They ought not to be treated as machines or slaves. All right, so that's the idea. And the reason I mentioned dignitatis humanae is because not to say, okay, the Catholics sort of figured this out. It's because this document, written in 1965, I think it ought to be the sort of inheritance of everyone who's committed to religious freedom, because it sort of articulates the case in both natural law terms and philosophical and theological terms. And then it does something else. It says that religious freedom isn't simply grounded in the dignity of the human person. It is that. Because of the dignity of the human person, people ought not to be coerced on fundamental issues. In particular, people's exercise of their conscience, their properly formed conscience, ought not to be violated. Right? Now, that doesn't mean you can just sort of claim your conscience to do anything. The point is, insofar as your conscience is oriented toward the natural and the moral law, it ought not to be destroyed or coerced. And that emerges from the dignity of the human person. But in Dignitatis Humanae, it also says, because of that, because human beings have dignity and ought to exercise freedom, at the same time, human beings are never isolated. Every person is born into a family and has a mother and father somewhere. Every person is born into a community. We're born into religious communities and into associations. And because humans are intrinsically social, that means religious freedom must also attach to societies and associations. Right? So there's a religious freedom for individuals, and there ought to be a religious freedom for individual religious institutions, right? And this, of course, sort of coheres with the American idea of a freedom of association. But Dignitatis Humanae sort of works this out And I think it's very important in this current context because there's a temptation right now to move religious freedom back to something like freedom of worship, in which religious freedom doesn't actually attach to institutions. The society, the sort of ecosystem of society is filled by the state, and the only thing that's inviolable are the sort of private things that you do. And so you can see how insidious this is, right? But dignitatis humanae, I think a proper understanding of religious freedom says, no, actually, it's not just freedom of worship, it's freedom of religion, and to have freedom of religion, you need to have free religious institutions, which themselves are going to limit the jurisdiction of the state. And so there's a huge amount at stake in that particular question. It might seem like philosophical sort of, hair splitting, but there's actually a sort of huge issue there. And then, because there's freedom of association and everyone is sort of, in some sense, dependent on a family for our existence, religious freedom connects to the freedom of parents to raise their children. And this is, I think, if anything, the sort of unique contribution of dignitatis humanae is to connect the idea of religious freedom with the freedom of families, right? If you don't have the freedom to raise your children in your religious traditions, to, for instance, school them in schools that represent and reflect that vision, then ultimately you're not exercising and enjoying religious freedom. We still, at the moment as Americans, enjoy this. My wife and I actually homeschool, and it's actually in Northern Virginia, it's called drive school rather than homeschool because you're using co-ops and you're all over the place. But that is in some ways the most robust expression of real religious freedom, to be able to bear children and to be able to raise them in your religious tradition. And so all those things are sort of in this document. So if you're interested in this issue, whether you're Catholic or Christian or not, there's a lot of really good argument in that, I think, that can give you, if you're interested in this issue, philosophical horsepower for making this case and for not reducing it merely to, well, freedom of religion is just about me getting to believe things in my head, right? Well, you have that, the Chinese in the People's Republic of China have that freedom, right? They can, in the privacy of their own homes, have any sort of crazy religious thoughts they want. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something much more robust. Now, why do I go into all that? I go into all that because we tend, when we're thinking about this issue, simply to take religious freedom for granted. That, well, of course the state shouldn't force people to be a member of a particular church. Of course the government shouldn't just unduly violate people's religious conscience. We very often don't know why that is. And it's because we inherited an intellectual and cultural tradition that's now embedded down in our moral intuitions. And so we just sort of treat it as a first principle. But those are now at stake, right? These are now contested ideas. And so we have to learn, I think, where they come from and how to sort of defend and articulate them. So that's why I spent that, and also I'm a philosopher and I can't bear to sort of go into the foundations of ideas. But that's why I spent 10 minutes on that. All right, so now to my argument. That's the idea of religious freedom. But what I want to argue is that religious freedom and economic freedom are inextricably linked, that they're connected in some way. And so the first sort of way to show this is at least merely sort of merely a correlation. Initially, most of you are familiar with the Index of Economic Freedom. There's another index called the Economic Freedom of the World, but the index is done by the Wall Street Journal and the Heritage Foundation here a couple of miles away. They've been doing this for a couple of decades, and what it is an index of all the countries of the world that we have data for with respect to the amount of economic freedom they enjoy. So how easy is it to hire people? How easy is it to get a job or to get a business license? How easy is it to buy property? How much corruption is there? These kinds of things. And for 20 some odd years, the Index of Economic Freedom has been ranking countries with respect to economic freedom. Now there's an important detail here. People, if you're not sort of used to thinking about economic issues, people often think that economic freedom refers to anarchy. That like the most economically free place is going to be the place where everybody gets to do what they want to do. Okay, so if that's what you think, get it out of your head. That's a completely sort of confused idea. That's the law of the jungle, all right? If you want to know what that looks like, read The Lord of the Flies, right? The law of the jungle is where the big kids lord it over and ultimately enslave and torment the weak, right? Economic freedom exists only in the context, social context, where there's rule of law, limited government, private property rights that then set up the conditions for free exchange, for win-win interactions between people to buy and sell and cooperate and compete. It's hard to get right. The good news is that since 1990, there's been at least a sort of increase of economic freedom around the world. A lot of details to sort of describe here. The main point to realize when you're talking about economic freedom is that there's a very tight correlation between economic freedom and widespread prosperity. So the causal links are complicated, but inevitably, if you look, the number one ranked country, which is still treated as a country in the Index of Economic Freedom, is Hong Kong. Right? It's a city-state, still now part of China, but still sort of its own economic unit. That's always number one. You want to know what's 178? North Korea. All right? And so if you just need a summary of the Index of Economic Freedom, Hong Kong's at the top, North Korea's at the bottom, right? That's really kind of all you need to know in some ways. Prosperity and a city-state in which people by the thousands every single day will risk their lives to get in, and a Stalinist state on the northern part of the Korean peninsula in which people will risk their lives and die to escape. All right? That's economic freedom. Now, this is a lot of work been done on economic freedom and the correlation between that and economic prosperity. There hasn't been nearly as much work, I think, on the connections of economic freedom and the way those connect. So what I've done is I went out and sort of looked for studies of this, and the Pew Foundation has done studies for several years of religious freedom. All right, now the problem is their chart, so the Index of Economic Freedom, the chart goes from green to red. All right, so the green places are the places that are the most economically free, and then you get to yellow and to orange and to red. And the gray is like places we don't have enough data for. All right, so you don't want to be in the red spots, you want to be in the green spots, all right? Well, it would be nice if the map that the Pew Foundation used the same color scales. Unfortunately, what they do is yellow to red, all right? And so what I want you to see here is that, okay, so this is the Index of Economic Freedom for 2015, all right? And it doesn't look significantly different from the one from 2014. Now here's the most recent, I'm going to overlay the Pew Foundation map from the most recent year for which they have data, which is 2009, all right? And so remember, yellow is the best. Whoops, let's try it again. All right, you see? So a lot of those places that were green are light yellow. The other thing you ought to notice, it takes a while to study it, so I'll just sort of tell you what I discovered by doing this, and I've continued to follow this for about a year, is that at the extremes there is a near perfect correlation between economic and religious freedom. In other words, the places that are the most economically free are overwhelmingly the places that are the most religiously free. And the places that are the least economically free are overwhelmingly the places that are the least religiously free. Did I say that right? All right, so at the extremes, there is a very tight correlation between these two different types of freedom. And I can just name some of the countries. So at the top of the Index of Economic Freedom, we've got Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, Switzerland, Canada. The US is number 12, which is good, but the trend line is a little bit depressing. At the bottom, here are the countries at the bottom: Turkmenistan, Iran, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Cuba, and North Korea. Right? That's essentially a list of religiously oppressive places, and they're at the bottom of the Index of Economic Freedom. So what this means is just kind of looking at the sort of macro scale, there simply is a connection between these things. Now, there's a lot of scatter in the middle. So a lot of countries in Latin America, for instance, have a high degree of religious freedom, but they sort of tend to be economic basket cases. And so I think what that means is that societies are complicated, and so it's not like the day you lose your economic freedom, you immediately lose your religious freedom as well. It's just, I think what happens is that over the long term, the social conditions that allow you to be economically free allow you to be religiously free, and vice versa, all right? That's the idea. And so at least at the extremes, we know just from looking at the countries of the world that these two things are related. Second thing is that the sort of philosophical foundations of both ideas are the same. Right, so I spent a little time talking about the basis for religious liberty and religious freedom, right, from Dignitatis Humanae. And so here's a list of them if you didn't quite catch them. The dignity of the individual, freedom of association, freedom of families, both to form and to have children and to raise their children in their religious tradition, and then limited government. Now, if you read Dignitatis Humanae, limited government is not in there. But it's everywhere implied. It's everywhere implied simply because it says that the state doesn't have absolute jurisdiction. So that means something has to limit the state. So what that means, there has to be something outside the state, right? Some reality. The danger in the 20th and 21st centuries is, and I think honestly this is the result of progressivism, which even non-progressives tend to imbibe, is to essentially treat social reality as two things. There's the state and there are individuals, or at best three things. There's the state, there's the economy, and there are individuals. That's a fatal mistake. It's a fatal mistake politically, socially, and economically. There are social realities. In fact, if you just think about your own life, right, especially the time that you spent growing up, most of the social realities that you experience directly and that have informed and shaped who you are not those things, right? Inside your family, right, you don't treat your children as liabilities or assets, right? It's not a sort of market. If you do, talk to me afterwards. It's a disastrous way to organize a family, right? So the family itself, the most basic social reality, is not one of these things. It's not the individual, it's not the state, and it's not the economy. Social entities like churches, like religious organizations, like voluntary organizations, like martial arts studios, right? Those are social realities that limit the state and that mediate between the individual and government, all right? Now, I'm naming all those things in terms of religious freedom, but I could spend an hour giving a lecture about the basis for economic freedom, and I would make exactly the same case, right? Economic freedom requires a dignity and protection of the individual and his or her conscience, right? So if you enjoy economic freedom, what does that mean? Well, it means that you at least have some choice about where you work. You can decide the type of schooling that you're going to get. So you feel like your boss is not paying you enough, you can quit and go somewhere else. When you make economic exchanges, right, you only do it, you only sell something that rightly belongs to you if you come to mutually beneficial terms. All these things are only possible in a context where there's a boundary around the things that people can do to you and can't do to you. The same thing is true with things like families and freedom of association. All those things important for religious freedom are also absolutely essential for economic freedom as well. And so if you just read, I mean, if you don't believe me on this, just read some of the stalwarts of economic freedom. And you don't have to read religious people. Read Ayn Rand, or read better, read Hayek or von Mises, or anarcho-libertarians if you want. Go with Murray Rothbard. Notice I'm not naming people like Michael Novak, who I think has both a robustly Christian view and also a free market view. Even those people that are not otherwise religious, invariably when they make the case for economic freedom, what they're doing is they're making a moral case for economic freedom. They argue that people ought not to be forced, that they ought not to be coerced, that it's just to coerce someone when they violate the rights of others, but that otherwise people should generally be left alone and not forced to do things they don't want to do. This is a moral claim that presupposes certain things about the intrinsic dignity of the individual, and that implies that the state is supposed to do some things and not supposed to do other things. It's just, I think it's almost impossible to disentangle the moral and philosophical case for religious freedom from the moral and philosophical case for economic freedom. I really don't know how you would do it. And the appeals end up pointing exactly to the same sorts of things, all right? And so it might seem, in the short run, that, okay, well, millennials all disagree about same-sex marriage, so let's not talk about that. Let's just talk about economic freedom. And all the while, what happens is that the jurisdiction of the state gets farther and farther and deeper into the details of our lives, to the point in which the state can declare by a vote of 5-4 in the Supreme Court that a perennial pre-political institution like marriage is not what we always thought it to be, right? That's a sort of ultimate violation of limited government. And that happens in part because we imagine that we can jettison these religious and social issues from these economic issues. Now, I actually think that because of this, because there is a sort of commonality in the philosophical case to be made for economic and religious freedom, that there's probably a positive causal feedback between these two kinds of freedom. Now, this is a very hard thing to prove, so I just want to give you a kind of get the mental picture in your mind. Now, what am I talking about? What I'm saying is if you live in a society, right, in which the government does certain things and it prevents people from violating each other's fundamental rights, and it protects property, and it protects contract law, and it protects us from aggressors, both foreign and domestic, and then leaves a huge amount of freedom where we can live, who we're going to marry, what jobs we're going to take, what we're going to train ourselves to do, how many children we're going to have, how we're going to educate our children. If you live in a society like that, Have I described a society that is economically free or one that's religiously free? Both, right? Because you need both of those freedoms. You need those kinds of things both to be economically free and to be religiously free. I suspect that there is actually a sort of virtuous cycle that gets set up in societies that generally enjoy large amounts of freedom, so that there's a kind of mutually reinforcing effect between these two types of freedom, and that there's a vicious cycle that gets set up on the other hand. That is, if one form of these freedoms is slowly denigrated and destroyed, the other one, at least long term, is bound to come along after it. All right, now it's a sort of conceptual argument, so I'm inviting you to think about that, but I suspect that there's a social dynamic like that at work. If you're planning on doing a PhD in sociology, here's an idea for you to get us some data on this, right? Because it's just intuitive at the moment. Now that I've laid this out, what I want to do is I want to give you one example of what happens when we fail to understand how these things are connected. And it won't surprise you to learn that I'm going to talk about the Health and Human Services mandate in the Affordable Care Act. All right? Now, am I saying that everyone that's concerned with religious freedom, that the U.S. Conference on Catholic Bishops and the National Association of Evangelicals all have to get graduate degrees in economics, right, in order to sort of tease these things out? No, of course not. In fact, if we all had to get graduate degrees in economics, we'd be in serious trouble, obviously, right? Because you all had that macro class in college. It was designed to turn you off to economics forever. And so it's just not going to happen. But the good news is that what we need to master, I think, to avoid making these mistakes in the future is what Henry Hazlitt calls the art of economics. And the art of economics is essentially an intellectual disposition. All right? It's a great book. If you read just one book on economics, I highly recommend it. It's called Economics in One Lesson. It was written in the 1950s. At the beginning of the book, Hazlitt doesn't talk about the science of economics like an academic discipline. He's talking about an intellectual disposition. And here's what he says. He said, the art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. Now, what's his point here? His point is essentially that you can master the art of economics just by training yourself to think through the unintended consequences of actions and policies. Right? In other words, if you can learn to ask what I've sometimes called the trillion-dollar question, and then what will happen, right? You have mastered the art of economics. Now why is that the trillion-dollar question? Well, I would maintain that if 535 members of Congress were trained in this, we could save trillions of dollars, right? That economic policies are usually advocated and passed into law, not because we have a clear understanding of what they're going to do, but because of the perception of the motivations that supported the policies in the first place. So the art of economics just consists in an intellectual virtue in which you think hard and carefully about what's actually or likely to happen if a policy is implemented. All right, so now let's take healthcare in this country, all right? So healthcare, think of healthcare initially as if it's just sort of an ordinary market, just like the market that we have for food and for houses and cars and gasoline, all the other things that we do, all right? So in a sort of normal market situation, so you have rule of law, right? So doctors can't compel you to use their services, and you can't compel people to render their services without paying them, right? And so it's something like this, in which you have doctors that have particular expertise and they're competing for customers or competing for patients, right? In this case, it's not going to be little girls, right, walking around looking for doctors. It's going to be the parents, right? But I've got little girls, so this is what I sort of think of, right? And so there's going to be a kind of a normal feedback between these two. So if I'm a parent, I'm looking for a doctor to treat my child, what am I going to do? I'm going to go online, I'm going to look for doctor recommendations, I'm going to talk to friends, you know, who's the best ear, nose, and throat doctor you have? I might actually do sort of economic calculations. Well, this doctor, actually, she's got really good ratings, she's close to my house, and she charges less than everyone else, right? It's like, you know, 3 checks. We don't do that ever, right? And if you doubt me, how much was your doctor's visit? How much did your last doctor's visit cost? Exactly, not the copay. How much did it actually cost? What was the price? You don't know. None of us know. And that tells you that we're already very far from any kind of normal market situation, right, when it comes to our health care. You know how much gas costs, right? You know how much cars and rent and everything else costs. So what's happening there? Well, what's happening is that we don't have a normal market situation, and we have not had a normal market situation in healthcare for decades. And this is essentially a result of things that happened during World War II. So in the 1930s and 1940s, there were all sorts of regulations put on businesses, including things called wage controls, which essentially said, okay, we're going to prevent inflation by telling companies, okay, you can only pay people this amount. You cannot pay them more than this amount for particular jobs. So it's essentially a ceiling, a cap on how much wages could be paid, right? Sort of the opposite of a minimum wage. Okay, so now what do you do if you're a company and you're trying to get the best employees, but you can't outcompete your competitors? You can't say, well, I'll pay these people more and they'll come work for me. Well, what you do is you think, okay, I'll come up with some non-pay compensation for them, things that aren't a part of the wage cap that I could give them, perks, right, that will entice them to come. And so companies started doing things like providing health care, right? So health care, certain types of vacation, right, certain types of pensions, those weren't subject to the wage caps. And so it created this weird situation where, come to the end of the 20th century, most adults associate their health care and connect their health care with their employer. That's where that came from. All right, that's a weird and artificial thing. The other thing that's weird and artificial is that healthcare or health insurance is not really insurance. It does something way beyond what normal insurance is for. So insurance is normally, the function of it is normally to essentially hedge against rare but catastrophic events, right? And so if you have collision on your car or you have liability, the purpose of that is not so you can sort of get off on some kind of good deal if you wreck your car. It's to protect you and to protect others in case you have a rare but unfortunate wreck, right? So that's what insurance is for. But imagine if you had this. Well, imagine if healthcare not only protected you in case of collision, gave you liability, but it also covered windshield wipers, filters, tires, car washes, gasoline, and oil changes. All right? Now, why don't we do that? Well, the reason is because those are sort of general maintenance things. They're not risks. They're anticipatable costs. And think how that would sort of change the way in which we act. If you just paid a certain fee for gasoline, for insurance, and it covered gas, would you spend a lot of time looking for the best deal for gasoline? No, of course not. You might think you would, but you would very quickly, you'd just go to the place that's most convenient. That's what we had in healthcare. And so what this is called the third-party payer problem. And what that is that it's a setup in which some entity or thing gets between the customer and the service provider. And it messes up weird market incentives. So remember that initial scenario where I'm just in a market looking for the best doctor for his or her services for my daughter, right? I'm comparing quality and accessibility and price, right? Well, what happened first with sort of employer-compensated health care, and then later these very large, semi-private, semi-public HMOs and PPOs, large insurance corporations. And that was most of our experience, right? Is that there's the doctor, there's the patient, and I interacted with the sort of terms of agreement of my insurance company, and then the doctor interacted on the other side with the insurance company that he or she used to get paid. Right? This scrambled the market. So what I've done is given you a somewhat simplified 5-minute description of the economic problem that everyone was dealing with. This has an effect. It tends to inflate the cost of healthcare and reduce the quality of healthcare. All right, so that was the problem. All right, so if that's the problem, and you wanted to increase accessibility, lower the price of healthcare, and make it a lot more sort of economically feasible, what would you do? If that's the problem. If the third-party payer problem is the problem with the market, what you'd do is you would come up with reforms that scrambled that in some way, that increased competition, that maybe allowed people to have the health insurance attached to them rather than their employer, lots of different options. You'd do something to solve the third-party payer problem. What did the Affordable Care Act do? It made it way worse. Right? Way worse. I'll give you just one sort of example of this. Some of you may remember the sort of political theater at the time. We were debating the Affordable Care Act, and people would, I think, Mitch McConnell had a sort of wheelbarrow come in with the pages of the Affordable Care Act printed out, and then, of course, someone at Not at Vox, but let's say at Huffington Post, pointed out, well, page numbers depends upon the font and these kinds of things. So, right? And so this is the argument. Well, don't make that argument. Let's just talk about numbers, right? Word counts, all right? So the Affordable Care Act is passed. It was the Affordable Care Act and another Reconciliation Act. 381,517 words, all right? Now that itself is troubling. That's more than half the length of the Lord of the Rings and not nearly as interesting, right? But a law, right? Laws are just, all they are is this agency is going to create these rules. So it's a mandate for agencies to create rules. Last time I checked, the number of rules written as a result of these acts, 11.5 million words, all right? And so if the third payer party problem was a problem before, we've got 11.5 million regulatory words now that stand between service providers and doctors and insurance companies and patients and pharmaceutical companies. It's obviously going to make it worse. And every person that understood the economics prior to this knew it was going to make it worse. But what happened? Instead, a lot of very well-meaning religious people, they didn't think carefully about the real economic problem. And so we're perfectly happy to advocate a solution that in fact not only made the economic problem worse, right? But if you follow the news, the sort of unfolding news of healthcare is that people are losing care and prices are ballooning. It's exactly what you would expect. So what did we end up with? We ended up with a massive regulatory solution that made the problem worse rather than better and invariably created violations of religious freedom. And so what's the situation we're in now? Well, so we're in the situation, so let's use the Little Sisters of the Poor. So the Little Sisters of the Poor believe that if they participate in a process in which they're providing abortifacient drugs, that they are participating in an intrinsically evil act, right? It's something that's not just bad because of the circumstances, it's an evil in itself. If the Little Sisters of the Poor wins, what will happen? They'll get an exemption, and they and other organizations like that will get an exemption. But now here's the crazy thing. Let's say you were a Catholic or an evangelical that advocated the Affordable Care Act, but now objects to the HHS mandate. This is the position you're in, is that what you want to do is you want to say, actually, I support an act that will force people who don't know what they're doing to engage in intrinsically evil acts. But I want to be accepted from that myself. That is not a position that I think any serious person ought to be in. Right? If you think it's an intrinsically evil act, you should not support a law that forces other people to be engaged in it. It's a very, very serious thing. And I think that's ultimately the cost and the consequences. The consequence of failing to recognize the connection between economic and religious freedom. Thank you very much. So I think we have a microphone, and since we are streaming this live, if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll pass the microphone around. Take a few minutes of questions, and then we'll break so you don't feel trapped that you have to stay here too long, but I'll stay around if you have some other questions. So.
Jay, thank you. That was superb.
Thank you.
You used the phrase freedom of association as a correlate between religious and economic liberty.
Yes.
Could you explore that a little bit more?
Absolutely, and I did sort of pass over that quickly. So if you think about it, freedom of association is just the idea that you ought to have, all things being equal, the freedom to associate with other people for all sorts of different reasons. And so in an economy, of course, you could think of, well, I have sort of economic freedom, so I have freedom to get a job, right, or have a freedom to quit a job or do something like that. But if you're going to really have economic freedom, what if you want to start a business, right? Well, you're going to have to be able to hire people, and you're going to have the freedom to be able to choose to hire people according to certain criteria and not hire people according to certain criteria. So by definition, you immediately get involved in this question of freedom of association. It would be impossible. I can't imagine the scenario if we had, okay, you had individual economic freedom, but it didn't in any way entail freedom of association. It's very hard to say what your your economic freedom would amount to, right? Because any economic activity that you're involved in is going to require associations. It's going to require certain social institutions and interactions that you presumably want generally to be voluntary, right? So that people shouldn't be coerced to work for you, and you shouldn't be forced to hire someone you don't want to hire, for instance. And so those things, they seem sort of obvious to us when it comes to religion, because we think, religions are always institutions of human persons coming together around sort of common interests and causes. Businesses are that way too, though, right? That's the very nature of trade, is that it is a social reality. And so it's just, the longer you think about it, at least the longer I've thought about this, the more obvious it seems to me that if you want a free society, then you need to be clear about what you mean by a free society and defend freedom and the institutions that give rise to that. And the result is going to be that you're going to get a heck of a lot of economic and a heck of a lot of religious freedom. Don't think that you're going to try to defend one and not defend the other. What's going to happen is you're going to end up losing both.
I want to go back to the countries, the two.
The correlations? Yeah.
So obviously, I agree with essentially what you're saying, but it's interesting, right? So let's take a country like India, right?
Right,
so
exactly.
It's the middle countries where you're going to
have
the
interesting. It's very complicated.
Right. So
yeah.
what do you? You've studied some of this.
Yes.
What do you think about? India has tremendous economic growth, but it also has incredible, areas where there are, Christians are being killed in villages, right? For, all these sorts of things. China is going to be the other thing people are going to throw at you, right?
Right.
So could you comment maybe on
Absolutely.
those two countries and tell me what you think about it?
Yeah, I would say that, and so what I think is interesting about this is that it's helpful because it prevents us from being simplistic, right? So the temptation would be to say, we're going to overlay these maps and there's going to be perfect correlation. There's not. There's correlation at the extremes. And then there's sort of mix in the area. And so India is an interesting case because there's also a lot of corruption in India. And so, I like China because China in some ways is it's confounding on both religious and economic grounds, right? Because it's still officially a communist country. It's still an authoritarian country. And yet if you look at what's happened in China, especially in urban China, just since 1990, it's amazing. I think the reason is because it's essentially a mixed situation. So what the Chinese did, those who are in power in Beijing did, is first of all, they figured out that an entirely nationalized economy is just a disaster. It's just empirically a disaster. And so they started by creating these economic enterprise zones. And one of these is in the Guangdong province in southern China. So if you go to Guangzhou, China, you go into a store to buy something, there's not even going to probably be a receipt. It's like the Wild West. That's how sort of low drag the economy is. It's far less intrusive than if you walk out here in Washington, D.C., right, where the NSA has all that data, right, the second you buy something at Rite Aid. So, and so I think what's happening is that these are societies that are sort of in transition. And so I think China at the moment is it's a weird sort of hybrid, right, in which you've still got a large amount of political control, but sort of purely on empirical grounds, I think the Chinese government has decided, look, we can't possibly compete with this utterly inefficient command economy that we had before. So here's the interesting question, is whether the emergence of growth and the emergence of a middle class in China, will that lead to greater political and religious freedom or not? Because I think what that is that's not a long-term situation. I think what happens is initially China, so when they released the reins in 1990, the vast majority of China was still peasants, still peasantry essentially. Now it's quickly becoming more and more urban. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but several 100 million Chinese have moved into cities since 1990. Much more of a middle class. It's politically connected. I suspect that goes on for 50 years, and those people will be very powerful and won't want all the sort of political restrictions. I think India's in the same sort of situation. I do think India benefited in some ways from certain kind of legal and religious traditions and from being, a British colony. That's maybe not nice to say, but I think there are benefits there. They were a British colony too long, though. So they were still a British colony when Britain became socialist. And so they got some really bad economic policies until the 1990s. And so I just think they're emerging from there. So what I think this means is that societies are big organic things. And so there can be slippage where there's one type of freedom sort of advances, one is held back. Another complication would be in certain city-states. So I actually believe there are things that can work in city-states that can't work in large political institutions. So there's things that could work in Sparta or ancient Athens or Singapore that can't scale. And so Singapore is very vibrant economically. It has very low corruption, but it doesn't have a whole lot of religious freedom. It doesn't look good on a religious freedom index, and there's a lot of social control. I think, though, if you tried to scale that it would be bad. So that'd be the way I would answer that, is that real societies are complicated things, but over the long haul, these freedoms sort of stand or fall together. It's a great question. And somebody does need to do a dissertation on that as well, if anybody's listening.
Mal Klein, Accuracy in Academia, and I'm sold. You convinced me.
Okay, great.
But my question is, have you been able to get this message to Young Americans for Liberty, Students for Liberty, or the Cato Institute?
I'm trying to. Yeah, I try to. So I honestly, I feel like, so I speak at the sort of intersection of religious and economic issues. And so I always feel like what I want to do is I want to persuade secular libertarians that, in fact, they have a stake in this. I also want to persuade them that they have a stake in things like marriage. And I want to convince religious people like myself that they have a real stake in economic freedom. And that's, both of those things to me are sort of frustrating. And so this argument's designed for those two groups of people. If you already agree, great. But there was someone up here. All right.
If I could return to the first question on
Yes.
freedom of association. By logic, it seems that the fundamental freedom is freedom of association, which is then applied in both the economic and the religious area. But the freedom of people to, now granted then in ordered liberty that comes in,
Right.
but is that,
I don't know.
is that oversimplified?
I think the way I would put it is that there is it's sort of like saying, okay, what's more fundamental, our sociality or our individuality, right? And so, well, okay, to say you have intrinsic value means it inheres in you. On the other hand, no human being with inalienable rights ever existed outside a social context, right? And so it's a bit of a chicken and an egg thing. And so what I would say probably is that what's important is to remember that freedom of religion and economic freedom and religious freedom connect both to our individuality and to our sociality. And it's a mistake to give up one or the other. Yeah, sure.
It seems to me that what's in danger most right now is not the freedom of the individual, as you're talking about it there within the individual's right to have all these things, but the freedom of association.
Absolutely. The freedom of association, and also, so just to take an issue like marriage, for instance, I think because of the American tradition, we think of freedom as attaching to individuals. And the reason is because that was the thing that was contested at the American founding. But what it didn't, so in other words, individuals are pre-political realities, right? The human individual, the state doesn't give you your rights. A just and limited state recognizes rights that already exist because of what you are, right? And that's the American experiment. The question is the individual the only pre-political reality? And I think that's the kind of real philosophical question we're having, is that one group of our segment of our population says, oh, institutions like family and marriage aren't pre-political. They're social constructions, right? And so we're free to sort of define them however we want or redefine them. And the other side, I think, rightly says, no, actually, if you look sort of historically and culturally and just sort of noodle it out, the family is a pre-political institution that pre-exists any state or political experiment. And in fact, it's probably more fundamental than individual rights, if you think about it, at least because individual rights, remember, were contested, right? This idea of individual rights, so there's an American Revolution in part over them. It actually never occurred to anyone to contest the pre-political reality of marriage until recently, right? Because it was just so obvious that it involved at least a man and a woman with the capacity to have children. It really never occurred to anyone to have to defend this. And now I think what we're having to do is to realize, oh, we actually need to be defending the pre-political reality of the individual and of certain fundamental institutions such as the family. That's how I would put it. It's a great point. And you know, the problem is we're still trying to figure out, we're in a position now when we're talking about marriage that people were in after Roe v. Wade in 1973. I mean, if you look at the way the Southern Baptist Convention thought, well, how do we respond to this? It took a couple of years. I think at the moment, it's going to take us a few years to figure out, okay, how do we make the case for natural marriage in a public and non-sectarian way? And so we're sort of working that out. And people here at FRC and people like Ryan Anderson and Robbie George are doing that. But I don't think we've got that down in our bones so that we could do it on an elevator quite yet. Right, maybe time for one more. Over here.
Thanks. Just briefly getting back to the whole idea of religious freedom and the family structure. I'm curious how you think the changes to China's one-child policy to a two-child policy is going to affect China's economy short-term, but then also down the road.
I mean, I think that it's, in a sense, it's an improvement, right? But it's still ultimately a violation of basic, I think, human rights. The idea that the state ought to stipulate any particular cap on how many children can have is, to me, it's just it's an obvious example of something states shouldn't do, right? It's just, that's not what a state is for. And so whether you say it's 1 or none or 5, the idea that the state, and in this case a centralized state with a lot of power, ought to have the authority to specify this is itself, I think, a total violation of the very concept of limited government. I do think it will free things up a little bit. I mean, it's already been, people that study this, it's sort of inconsistently applied, right? And so if you're in particular places in China, of course, away from watchful eyes, fewer, the authorities are less likely to know how many children you have, or if you're quite wealthy, right? You can afford it, you can afford to pay the tax. It's not in the short run going to solve the demographic problem, because the one-child problem has been going for a long time now, and so you already have, marriable males, millions of them without females, and I think that social problem is going to happen either way. So on the one hand, I'd say, okay, it's a slight improvement, but it's sort of like, okay, we're going to let you live 2 years rather than 1 year, and then we're going to kill you arbitrarily. I guess that's an improvement, right? But it's still a kind of, the state shouldn't do that, and so that's, and the worrisome thing to me is that, there were some American academics that, one here last week, I won't name any names, that published an article, and she said, well, it was sort of regrettable that China was doing this because, of course, we're destroying the planet. We don't, already too many people. I mean, this is, and so it's not like this is restricted to China, this idea that human freedom and the freedom to be able to have children, we take that for granted, but there are at least intellectuals in American context that actually wish China had not changed the policy. All right, well, thank you. Thanks for coming, and I'll stay around for questions afterwards. Appreciate it.